Black Cats Run podcast. I'm Tristan Black Ingersoll, and this is Black Cats Run. A letter was written to the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne in, I think, 786, and in the letter there was the following phrase: "And those people should not be listened to who keep saying the voice of the people is the voice of God, since the riotousness of the crowd is always very close to madness." This quote is oftentimes referenced in culture as the subphrase Vox Populi, Vox Dei. The voice of people is the voice of God, and is used as a sort of whatever the group thinks, whatever the majority convenes around as consensus must be best practice. Is this actually true when we try to understand how and why training works? Let's get into today's episode. So that quote in and of itself, I think, encapsulates the challenge of trying to understand training, is that it's something in either human behavior or at least human behavior within certain Western cultures that, our knowledge of something is sometimes fragmented in such a way and missing such, essential components that we end up representing a belief or understanding or perspective or strategy that is very much not the reality of what you want to be doing. And I think this quote is such a excellent articulation and demonstration of this phenomena, because people use the phrase Vox Populi, Vox Dei, the voice of people is the voice of God, to endorse the concept of whatever is most commonly said is best and true and should be accepted. But that in and of itself is a representation of a failure to recognize all of the information that's present, which is that, as the quote goes on to say, that actually it is the case that the belief that whatever the majority of people think is right is itself flawed, because consensus is not by any means in and of itself a process of verification or validation. And yet overwhelmingly, it's just so difficult to separate our understandings from what we see in terms of, the conversations and the dialogues around us. It's one of the things that makes researching from, any kind of like source material challenging, because you're going to most easily and regularly encounter things that are consensus. And sometimes, consensus is formed around conclusions that are correct, and sometimes consensus is formed around conclusions that are incorrect. And so how do you make the distinction between those things? Because if you take any understanding, in fairness, right, we're not saying that just because something is outside of consensus that now you're more likely to be correct. But that if you take any understanding as true and you don't have a way to determine, measure, or evaluate that acceptance, then how can you determine that what you're doing is correct? And we can extend this concept to training, right? How do we know if our training is correct? How do we know the best way, I guess we can say, the best way to get from point A to point B, or if getting from point A to point B is going to be possible? And I think oftentimes the consensus, common practices and strategies are agreed upon because that's sort of what people feel you're supposed to do, and they don't know enough to be able to question or measure what they're doing. And so then the consequence is what is a reasonable point A to point B shift is like going to be defined by what has been possible under that particular paradigm of approach. But that possibility of A to B is only defined within the sort of leveraging effect of that particular training style or strategy or intervention or plan or environment or culture, or however you want to sort of label that phenomena that is, engagement and performance of sport, engagement with and performance of sport, we should say. So when we're trying to make better sense of this, like we need to think about, well, what is a reasonable point A to point B, and that there are factors that are going to skewer us like senseless, if you will, and just sort of like take our brain and our capacity to think independently and just sort of rotate it and cook it, over the fire of consensus, and just sort of like, seal in, if you will, like we're now encasing that common belief, and we'd just become increasingly entrenched in that, and then trying to break out of that is challenging. And it's especially difficult because when you try to shift to a different approach, well, then consensus is going to act upon you. I mean, this is what peer pressure really is. It's not, your buddy telling you to go run across the highway with a blindfold on. Peer pressure is that constant, continuous sense and need and urgency that, we may feel to conform and engage with what is kind of like the social, cultural norm or norm set. And that, sometimes like those can be good things, like being friendly to people, being considerate, being kind, being polite, right? Those are good things. But, tying people to a post and setting them on fire because they want to talk about the evidence that shows that, the earth is not the center of the universe, and they want to talk about, the evidence for heliocentrism. Well, that, might have been an accepted behavior at one point in time, unfortunately for Giordano Bruno, but it doesn't mean it's good, right? So we have to have and impose tools of understanding, right, rational method to make sense of this stuff. And in particular, we need to be able to measure and evaluate if our training is going to be effective as a strategy or approach. And so trying to find tools of assessment is important, right? But you can measure improvement is the problem, right? As you can generate improvement, because if you have somebody do something versus nothing, then that something is going to have an effect that's greater than doing nothing. Right? But that wouldn't mean that whatever that something is inherently the most valuable of all of the possible somethings that you should do, right? And we want to move in the direction of choices around, training and engagement with our sports and our fitness activities as, people and athletes that are going to be, the most rewarding and, and effective and impactful. And there's at the end of the day, really no disconnect between training practices that are most effective for improvement and also training practices that are the most rewarding, healthful, and impactful. I mean, injuries are so commonplace, and that's not a novel occurrence, but they're so commonplace in, running in particular, that it's just sort of accepted, and to the point where I've sometimes wondered if some people feel like they're missing out if they don't have an injury, that like they're missing out on some essential part of the cultural experience of like whatever their sort of gauntlets of adversity that they think go through and sort of totally like, anneal you and leave you with that, core identity of I am an endurance athlete, I am a middle distance runner, whatever. And trying to impose a rational framework of understanding is just so important. So let's think first, though, about, this point A to point B concept. So how do we know if an improvement is reasonable, attainable, or possible? Okay. So let's say that you're a 6-minute miler, right? You can run the mile in 6 minutes. And then we said that, okay, in 12 to 14 months, we can get you to 5:40 in the mile. That really wouldn't be a big deal, right? That doesn't seem that far-fetched. And if we change that, though, and we say you're about a 5-minute miler, and we say, well, we can get you to a 4:40 or a sub 4:40 mile in 12 minutes or 14 months. Now, right, suddenly that might seem like, whoa, that's crazy. This has got to be this is impossible. I can't even believe that could occur. But why do we have that different reaction? Because we're talking about a, comparable improvement of 20 seconds. And we're talking about over 12 to 14 months, right? A year to a year and 2 months-ish, making an improvement of 20 seconds in the mile. So if we just think of that on like what would our rate of improvement have to be, that's really only an improvement of about maybe like 1.25 to 1.4 seconds per month. Okay. Which when you scale it like that, that's not that inconceivable. And if we go a little further, that means improving by about 0.05 of a second per day. Or in other words, creating a benefit where the average day of training leads to an average impact on our ability to run the mile of 0.05 of a second. Okay. So that's right, not a big deal, right? And so why would it matter if you're going from 6 minutes to 5:40 versus if you're going from 5-minute mile to a 4:40 mile? It's still, right, making an extremely small improvement. And, at 0.05 of a second impact on your mile race performance per day of training, which may, if a good day of training, if you really have established, yourself and you're engaged with athletics, that could be an hour to 2 hours of training activity a day, depending on your routines. Like to say that you're getting 0.05 of a second benefit in fitness from an hour to 2 hours of activity. Well, let's take that a step further. That means we're saying that for every minute of training, you're getting somewhere between 4/10,000ths of a second benefit towards mile performance and 8/10,000ths of a second towards, mile performance. That's very moderate, right? And yet what we see oftentimes, with junior athletes, and I mean junior in the sense of like, right, in international, they make this distinction between, people over under the age of 18. But for, so-called junior age athletes, people usually reach towards the end of their junior period of sports. And then most people will go to and get into maybe like senior year of high school, sometimes starting in junior year of high school, and will run the same times or slower, if they run through college. And then afterwards, then it's sort of a wash because it's already different to continue to engage with that stuff if you're just an amateur. And then if it's not something that has been really working for you and you've been progressing, it becomes increasingly challenging to say, well, what am I doing with this? Like, I may enjoy exercise and I may enjoy being fit, but what validation in terms of pursuit of mastery am I getting? Because you're not that, and that maybe hasn't happened for you for 5 or 6 years. And so now you're looking at, improving by 20 seconds in the mile in a year is reasonable, I would argue. I mean, then there's more context to this, and I'll get into that, right? Because you might say, well, you can't improve by 20 seconds in the mile indefinitely. And that's certainly true, right? Obviously, right? Mathematically, that can't happen. But at the same time, though, right, we're seeing that people might spend 6 years and they might only demonstrate a regression in performance. So what's going on here? How can we understand, the problems of A to B, and when A to B apparently just becomes A to A, or I guess A to Z if you're going backwards so much that you're just reversing. Would that be A to negative A? I don't know. This is why we use numbers and not letters for math. Unless you're using letters for math, whatever. Let's set that to the side. So when we're looking at this stuff, okay, what makes it realistic or unrealistic, right, in our mind is the social construction of the significance of performance. So if you're talking about let's say a junior level or a high school aged male athlete, and you say from 5 minutes to 440, that's reasonable, right? Although you would still consider 440 to be, a stronger performance because, in some states, a 440 mile means that you might be running at the state championship, right? And more populous states like California or Texas or whatever, I think obviously you have more competitors, so your sample size is bigger, right? The 440 mile isn't going to be as maybe significant, but in, more moderately sized, lower population states, so a 440 mile in high school is a pretty big benchmark. But whereas a 5 minute mile means you're just sort of making up the numbers, so to speak. However, if you're looking at female junior age group athletes, high school age athletes, and you're talking about going from a 5 minute mile to a 440 mile, now this is like crazy, right? All of a sudden this becomes absurd. And the reason why that's absurd to people is because, on the one hand, right, we do have some differences in maximum performances exhibited by female athletes versus male athletes, right? But the women's world record in the mile is 407, which is quite a bit faster than 440. So it's not like, you're talking about running the world record. And, women run now the marathon at 5 minute pace. The very best women in the world are running that at 5 minutes a mile, right? So we're talking about running somewhat faster than world record marathon pace for a single mile. Okay, well now again, right? So we see how our perspective and what we're comparing things to is shifting this. So our social construction of this stuff is what is significant, because if you back off to the 6 minutes mile to the 540 mile and you said that's what you're going to do with the high school female athlete, now that becomes acceptable again. And in terms of people think that that's a reasonable thing to, try to achieve. And I think part of the sense of like, going from 5 minute mile to 440 mile is crazy for, say, female athletes, but not so for male athletes, has to do with the social construction of the significance of performance, right? So 5 minute miling is already considered to be very good for female athletes in high school. And so then if you're going faster than that, we have this idea that it just becomes increasingly improbable. Okay, but that probabilities outcome or probability likelihoods that we're seeing there are reflective of the point A's to point B's that have happened as a result of the practices that people apply. So we shouldn't even be asking ourselves, is going from a 6 minute mile to a 540 mile more or less realistic than going from a 5 minute mile to a 440 mile? That's because that's not really what you're doing, right? That's a part of the misnomer, is you're not going out every day and you're not running the mile every day and trying to improve by 5 hundredths of a second linearly until you are now in a little over a year running 20 seconds faster. That's not how we train, right? We know that's not how that works. And in a sense, traditional high intensity intervals, though, that's basically what they are trying to do, is they're trying to do a version of, well, let's go out and every day go a little bit faster and just inch towards this, like you're doing, some sort of extremely hyper gradual alpine climb. That's not how training works. And so if you don't understand how training works, then you can't understand, how this progression is possible. And so because, though, going out every day and trying to climb that high intensity interval ladder and trying to ratchet the pace down towards, people do it a little bit more indirectly, but it's still the basic assumption that X progression in performed velocity in training equates to Y outcome in measured competition performance. Okay. And that makes this sort of simplistic, building block sense, but that's not what we know to be true about training, but that is the Vox Populi view of training. Okay. And so then the problem that we say exists here is a mindset problem. Okay. As we say then, well, because we're just stacking these building blocks. And so then it's a mindset problem. And, I think of this as this kind of like mind magic hypothesis, that the mind sort of somehow magically, through our imposition of consciousness and conscious intent and will, sort of create that like outcome and that capacity. And, we induce conversations about, non-factors, around the mind and mindset and mentality and belief, all the time, because it's an outcome of, our fantasies about, how sports performance works. This idea that, well, I'll just believe in myself, whatever that means, however you do that, right? But it will work, and then that will cause all of these things to just sort of manifest. And that like there's this power of positive thinking that you're just going to like change your body's physiology by believing that you're going to be faster, right? I mean, the number of people over human history who have believed or hoped or wanted desperately with all of their core being to, have things be different for them, if incalculable, right? And that's just not the way this stuff works. We're ascribing significance to the brain and consciousness in the wrong way. The brain definitely plays a role here. So if we want to know how likely or reasonable an improvement of 20 seconds in the mile is, we need to really be looking not at that kind of a, simplistic building block. I just, apply my mental toughness and I just ratchet it down and I get tougher and stronger. And, then I just sort of, I think I can, the little train that could. Instead, what we want to say is like, well, what is the possible increased response in fitness adaptation that we can get from changing our training? So one aspect of this is like, your training approach might ramp faster in terms of fitness than somebody else's. Okay. But what about the fact that if you have been doing a training program that is minimally effective? Okay. So if you have an athlete who runs, and it doesn't matter what it is, it could be starting at 6 minutes, trying to go to 5:40, starting at 5 minutes, trying to go to 4:40. If you have individual X, okay, and that person, if individual X can run that mile in 5 minutes, and they're basically, most commonly maybe working out for 15 to 30 minutes a day, and then, any other training is maybe some hyper, I would argue hyper ineffectual, high intensity training. And we'll get into why, that's ineffectual. But of course, if you're a long-time listener of the podcast, you probably already know why that's ineffectual, right? We've explored that stuff at length. If we then, right, and we want you to improve by 20 seconds in the mile over 14 months. Well, if they keep doing what they're doing, the probability they're going to make that improvement is close to zero. And then what happens is people will go they'll move forward, right? And so if you're the 6 minute miler, right, you're maybe going to have a harder time finding an opportunity to go to a college, which, maybe has had either historically or recently, a stronger running program and then participate in that program. But if you're the 5 minute miler, okay, maybe you're going to get that opportunity. And yet most of those people don't progress because they aren't doing training that's effective. They're just doing more and more high intensity, and that high intensity isn't really targeting, the way in which training improves. And so they just, and then right, the injuries are happening. And the problem is people take these exceptions to the rule, and instead of looking at and asking the question, well, why are they doing or experiencing, maybe we should say, why are they experiencing this scale of improvement that nobody else is? Instead, they just say, well, this is proof of concept. And then it goes back to the mind thought, right? that like, you have to be able, you're not thinking the right way, you're not approaching it the right way, you're not doing the things you need to, you're recovering everything except everything under the sun is the problem, except the coach and the training the coach is telling you to do. It's everything else, right? And that's just awfully convenient to my mind. So, however, right, if we say we're going to change now from running 15 to 30 minutes a day, and over the next 14 months, we're going to run 50 to 100 minutes a day. And then, in addition to that, we're going to take those 50 to 100 minutes a day, and we're going to look to approach those minutes in such a way that we're getting as much adaptive value out of those minutes. How can we structure and design those minutes to have the most possible impact on our fitness level, right? And we know that the lactate threshold is the benchmark for fitness and possible performance. Well, now is it going to be reasonable to say we expect somebody to improve by 20 seconds? Absolutely, right? So the issue is not how fast a possible time is, okay? Because, the reality is everybody comes to stuff as their own person, right? And we all start at our own level, right? And for whatever variety of factors cause that to be true, some of us maybe, get to a higher level than other people, right? And there's different reasons for that, right? We don't all have the inevitable potential to run and ultimately match the world record in whatever distance, right? That's not the case. Even at the very best runners in the world, right? You see that they can't all be equally good at all distances. So there is variance, right? There's variation. So we're not all going to get to the incredible, awesome, ultimate level. And some of us, right, are going from 6 minutes. And well, if we're training, in a way that's ineffective and we can have the opportunity to radically change our training, well, now we can make that jump, right? But if we are training ineffectively and then we continue to train ineffectively, well, it's less likely that we're going to make that jump, right? Because if we haven't especially if we already are not on a continued rate of improvement, right? And that's the other problem is if you don't have the evidence to support that your current method is effective, then you definitely should not anticipate additional improvement. But if that method is showing some improvement, then I would actually anticipate that you would get an even more magnified response, because that would suggest that somebody is maybe a little bit more responsive to training just at baseline than other people. And that responsiveness variance might be one of the reasons why some people end up reaching higher levels of performance than other people. Yeah, but ironically, I think sometimes it can be challenging to engage with a point A to point B possibility that maybe defies, our expectations of where we feel we should be able to fit in the sort of spectrum of performance and where we should be able to fit against the scale of what other competitors do. But I think that's where, again, that, this Vox Populi, Vox Dei trap, I guess, if you will, of assuming that whatever people say is reasonable, is doable, is or isn't, is somehow has, I guess we want to say, has an inherent factualness to that. I don't think that that's valid. So it's this, it's like a contradiction in term, maybe in a sense, because it's okay, yeah, there's a limit out there somewhere, but, you can't encounter that limit unless you move towards it. So then why does training work like this? Why would it make sense, right, to say from what we know about how training actually works and how the body is responding and adapting to training, why would it make sense to say that this kind of a transformation would be possible, doable, attainable, if you have this, variance in training, if you can optimize what you can do, right? Because we know that there's one belief that it's bad to run a lot. And my opinion on that is I think this is a thing that's sort of foisted by a lot of college coaches. Don't like high school athletes who've run a lot because, if you want to demonstrate that you're good at your job, you need to bring people into your program that you're responsible for. and you need to create improvement. So if you can find people who've been doing very little training, and then you have them, or maybe, effectively, in this grand scheme of things, effectively no training, and then you give them training, even if that's poor training, they'll probably improve. But if you find athletes who've been trained very well and you bring them into an environment with poor training, then they're not going to improve. And if anything, they might regress because now their training is less effective than what they've done. And so the bias, the confirmation bias with college coaches is to say that, oh, it's bad for high school athletes to be trained. They shouldn't run a lot in high school. Those athletes aren't going to improve. Well, of course they're going to think that, right? Because otherwise, the only other alternative is that they're not good at training athletes and they don't know how to train athletes. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people who, are just sort of following the herd in terms of how they think training should happen, and they don't actually have any tools, right? And you have a lot of people for whom it's like, oh, I got pretty good at running and I got to whatever, and so I know stuff. And then there's this sense of well, tell me the secrets, buddy. Tell me the way. And then they just sort of are they just sort of formulaically are well, we do this and we do this because this is what I did and we did this then, and so we can do that. No, you can just do this slower version or this faster version. And there's that's not coaching, in my opinion. And I guess we've defined that as coaching, but that's not. And if that's coaching, then I don't want to be his coach because that's not effective, right? That's not an evidence-based practice. That's not using, reasoning. Because what actually should happen is if you want to get the athletes who are well-trained, because then if you know how to train athletes, now you don't have to spend years trying to bridge this gap to get them to the point where they can train well. Okay, now you can work with them, and have them train well, right away. And if you take athletes who have trained a lot and trained well in high school, and then you put them in an environment where people train a lot and train well, then they will improve, because it's not about their mentality, right? It's about their approach. Now, mentality is tied to approach, right? So one of the whys training works, I suppose, is is rooted in our consciousness, because if we are making rational, measured choices about approach to training, then we're reaching rational and reasoned understandings about what the outcomes of our choices are going to be. And when we have knowledge about the impactfulness of our strategy, then it's a preferred, an easy choice for us to engage with that strategy. But when everything is abstract and unfamiliar, then why would you do it? It's the same concept as, when you're a teacher and you're teaching a class. If people don't have a concept of the value of what you're doing, or the value of what you're asking them to be doing, then the likelihood they're going to engage with it correctly or be interested in engaging with it is low. But if you can show people that they're getting better at things, then they're more likely to engage with it, because, that feeling of mastery is something that people find inherently rewarding. And, it meets some of our, psychological needs, right? It's related to self-esteem and self-actualization. And, when we can be good at things, it helps to improve the ways in which we feel we can relate to others, because we feel more valued and, meaningful and relevant and impactful in, our social groups and our community and society as a whole. Okay, so our mindset does matter in that way, but it's not about, just believing in and just staying positive and that's not the case, right? Positive feeling is the outcome of training well. It's not positive feeling is done to make training work, right? The positive feeling good and happy is a symptom of things going well. Because if positivity was simply this thing that you impose to make things good, then it would be appropriate to go to people who are depressed and say, well, be happy. And we know that that's obviously not how that should work. So the core aspect then, though, really of why training works, I think, can be explained with the concept of epigenetics. So epigenetics, right, has the word gene in it, Gene, not blue jeans. But genes, right? And epigenetics is the way that genes express themselves in response to our environment. So there are ways in which your genes are going to engage, do things, right, in terms of impacting the direction or the ordering of your physiology and, the structure and function of your body in different ways, depending on what are these sort of external factors of our environment, okay? And that is where adaptation and change can occur. And so the way in which epigenetics works, I think a simplistic way is to say that, well, the genes are going to change the way they function, or different genes are going to be acting and, signaling in different ways, specific to the environment that we're in. Okay. But if that were true, then the idea of, well, we just go out and we just practice running, at five, we're just going to go out and we're going to run at 400s at this pace. And then we're going to epigenetically get better at that. And then we're just going to keep walking those repeat 400 paces down. But that's not what works, because if that was the case, like, American high school athletes would be like the best runners in the world. And we just don't see that. It's just not at that level. And especially as you go to longer and longer distances, American athletes become less and less and less competitively relevant. And then by the time you get to like the marathon, they're just not even a factor anymore. And, some people use racist theories to explain that difference, and I think that's just absurd. So the better way to understand epigenetics is to try to use the concept of opportunity cost and the central governor, right, to explain this. So for those of you who haven't heard us discuss the central governor on the podcast before, central governor theory proposes that the brain, not your conscious right thoughts, but that the unconscious function of your brain basically is regulating, right? It's the central regulator for everything in the body. And, the Tim Noakes, has evidence for this, Professor Tim Noakes. And, we can talk more about the central governor, in detail on another episode. But for our purposes here, right, we want to understand that the brain, right, is probably in some way, shape, or form regulating or engaging with the epigenetic response, right? So that you don't have epigenetic response without the brain being present. Like, so because if you turned the brain off, then you're dead. So you can't really separate these things and say that, well, epigenetic response is independent of the brain. So that in the sense that, the way in which epigenetics are regulated, right, is partly influenced by the brain. And the regulation pattern of the central governor then can be modeled on to understand how epigenetic, responses are going to happen. So the central governor regulates basically towards energy efficiency. So the reason why this makes sense is because, energy efficiency is naturally selected for in evolution. Because if you have two, organisms, and one organism can accomplish more with less energy, they're over, billions of years, that is going to be more successful more often, right? Because they don't need to feed as frequently, and because they can accomplish more faster, better, more effectively with a higher probability of success, because they're more energy efficient. So they're more likely to survive to the point of, reproduction. And so that is that trend, that tendency towards, efficiency of energy use is going to be adapted for. So therefore, the brain and the central governor, right, function on that concept of energy efficiency. Like, for example, the brain very clearly regulates through like instinctive drives, right, for hunger, for sleep, for sedentism, right, sitting down and doing nothing. These are all encouraging the uptake, storage, and minimal use of energy, okay? And to survive, basically, we know that calories in, energy in, needs to be at absolute minimum equal to energy out, right? So we need to be, right, it's a part of self-maintenance as an organism, So if you eat a little less calories than you need to, then if your intake is less than your expenditure on a couple days, well, at first that will result in weight loss, right? But eventually you die, you starve to death, right? You can't sustain that indefinitely, right? So it just doesn't work, right? So we know that we need to have that balance, right? Because efficiency is there. And so trying to always take in more and then storing it, and the ability of human beings to gain enormous amounts of weight, and other animals too, but we have access to food abundance in a way other animals do not. So it's easier for us to exhibit this kind of weight gain, right, is a consequence of that. And the body just continues to feel hungry and produce that drive to eat food. And some of the evidence around that shows that it's very difficult to lose weight no matter how big you are, because you're apostat. Your body just does not want to lose weight, right? It resists that, and that resistance is the central governor. So, the whole mechanism here, right, is towards efficiency. And so if you think of weight gain perhaps as kind of an epigenetic response, right, we're seeing an epigenetic response towards efficiency. And that also shows that epigenetics don't inherently move towards athletic performance, right? Epigenetics move towards energy efficiency. So when we exercise, right, do physical activity, the first thing the central governor is doing is it tries to make energy demanding things feel bad, right? And this is where you can go from feeling horrible to much better over a few days of running, but that your actual fitness hasn't fundamentally really probably changed that much, right? But you can experience a significant increase in ease. So that resistance, that discomfort, that pain, the maybe feelings of disinterest or whatever, boredom, I don't want to get up, I don't want to whatever. Those are all feelings that, if you think about it, feed into the body's ability to conserve its energy, right? And that's basically, I would say, in a sense, that the central governor is testing, through its engagement with our conscious self of okay, well, how much do we really need to do this? And if it's really a big deal, then we'll engage with it. And then you could think too about how adrenal responsiveness also can play a role, right? When we feel heightened, right? Arousal to challenges, right? And excitement, and can cause us to engage with things with a feeling of relative comfort, and that can overcome that, right, in the short term. But with training, then, right, training would be applying energy demands with some sort of minimal level of frequency and consistency. And if that energy demand is similar enough for long enough, then the opportunity cost here now shifts not in favor of, well, because it doesn't take a lot of energy for the body to induce pain, right? So, hey, it's much more energy efficient to say, here's some pain, and then you stop doing it because you're it's not worth it, okay? And genuinely, that's sort of the feeling of being really uncomfortable when you're exercising at a certain point. You're saying, literally asking yourself, is this worth it? And that's what the central governor really wants us to be doing, in a sense. Although the central, you can't really want anything, because that would imply it has consciousness, and it doesn't. But not in the way we understand consciousness, right? It has this sort of mechanistic, selected for, function, right? So it has sort of purpose, right, in that way, I guess we might say. But if we are, applying training consistently, right, and frequently, then, now we're using lots and lots of energy, okay? And if that just keeps happening, well, the body is now basically, in a sense, going to interpret this as if, okay, somehow our environment is different, right? And this isn't something that we can escape, that this is here. And so now, what's more efficient? Well, what's more efficient is to use less energy. So if, let's say, for example, you're going to do 600 minutes a week of exercise, and then at 4,000 calories a day, and then 600 minutes of exercise a week at 3,000 calories a day, which of those is more efficient? Well, obviously 3,000 calories. So if the body can change itself to where it can do exercise with greater efficiency, then that's going to be more effective. And, if you run for an hour and you're running over your lactate threshold, well, that's less efficient. And we know it's less efficient because failure will be reached more quickly if you continue to try to run at that pace after 60 minutes. But if you try to run under 60 minutes, if you try to run under threshold for 60 minutes, that's more efficient and you'll be able to go for longer before falling apart. Okay. Now, it's not about going slower here, right? It's about where you are on threshold. So you could have somebody, who, is going 5 watts a kilogram, which is probably roughly running 5 meters per second. And some people could do this for 2 hours. Some people can only do this for 2 minutes. So we're not saying that slower speeds are inherently more energy efficient. We're saying that the way in which the body has adapted itself determines our level of energy efficiency. Because if it was just about available energy, then everybody would be able to, run the marathon in under 2 hours or run the mile in under 4 minutes as long as they ate enough energy, right? So it's not about available energy, it's about efficiency, right? And how have we changed? And so that's what the epigenetic response is the epigenetic response is creating physiological adaptations. For example, right, we see that as we improve in fitness, we can work at a higher rate before we start to see an increase in blood lactate concentration. And that means that we have become more efficient, right? So it is taking less energy. We're performing more work, right? And that's what's fascinating about is honestly, the scale to which the human body can increase its efficiency, I think, is sometimes not really fully appreciated because we can just drastically and fundamentally alter and improve that. Now some people then think, well, the more we push it, the more we're going to get this epigenetic response of becoming more efficient because, that's what the central, no. If it's too stressful, then we can't adapt enough, right? Or do enough to really reach adaptation, right? Because we need to do enough to create this sense of you're basically every time you go for a run, right? The length of the run and then how long it's been since your last run, determines what's going on, right? So it's if you're driving a car and you're riding a bike and you pedal, right? Let's talk about it as a bike. You're riding a bike and you do a bunch of pedal strokes really fast, right? And then you stop pedaling. Well, you're going to continue for a while, and then eventually you'll start to decelerate. And then if you want to maintain that, you need to pedal again. And so every day when you go out and you engage with that appropriate level of stress, right, then the body is recognizing that and saying, I see, right? We need to really continue to get more efficient so we can be better at surviving in this environment. Plus, if we really wanted to, this idea of maximizing work intensity isn't effective because if that was the case, all you would need to do is just get, a barbell, put a bunch of weight on it, throw it on your shoulders, and just start doing squats as fast as you can with as much weight as you can, right? Until you're exhausted. People who do that are not good runners. That's not how you get good at running, right? We know that that's true, right? It's just not effective. So another way to think about this is if you going back to that example of if somebody starts out the 6-minute mile or the 5-minute mile and they're running 15 to 30 minutes a day, then to me that's non-environmental in the sense that that's not an environment that's any different than really being sedentary. Now, obviously it's having some degree of impact, but for the sake of the concept we're trying to illustrate, that's not enough of an environmental effect for the body to make, the kinds of changes that we see that really continue to push performance forward. The body will make some changes, and then it will be like efficient enough, and it's just like not frequent enough for the body to really care. Like there's no, like, why would the body waste a bunch of energy trying to get really efficient at something that doesn't demand like a lot of energy, right? But so the thing is, as you train more, you're demanding more energy. And then as you train more frequently, you're also constantly creating that pressure of energy use. Okay. So when you combine high volume of training and you combine frequency of training, that's why you start getting these incredible epigenetic responses, because now you created like a totally different, from the body's perspective, our survival environment, right? And if our quote unquote survival, at least from the central governor's perspective, requires 60 plus minutes of activity, then the body will start to adapt to do this more and more efficiently, right? And so we see better use of lactate, which is why we start running faster and faster and not seeing blood lactate accumulation occur until much higher levels of work. And it also, we see it become subjectively easier. And this is where, again, like the mitochondrial reticulum are increasing, because if the mitochondria are consuming and utilizing the lactate, then, at a certain point, it's, how much mitochondria do you have? Well, making mitochondria and sustaining a mitochondrial reticulum of a scale is going to require energy. So you wouldn't want to spend more energy. So like, let's say that if you want to increase your mitochondrial, let's assume, for the sake of argument, let's assume that mitochondrial capacity or mitochondrial like volume or scale or whatever. Let's say mitochondrial scale. Let's say mitochondrial scale is directly indicative of where your lactate threshold is going to be. So in that example, we would be saying that lactate threshold measures or directly reflects mitochondrial scale. So that means if your lactate threshold is improving, that means you're creating more mitochondria. So let's think about this from an opportunity cost perspective, and you could probably model this mathematically, and it's sort of hard to do that and then verbally just describe that. So if I think of a good way to create an infographic for that, I'll upload that maybe to the Instagram at some point. But essentially, right, the opportunity cost here is you're only going to spend more energy to increase and then sustain a larger mitochondrial reticulum if that leads to an aggregate like energy savings versus maintaining the same size of or scale of mitochondrial reticulum. So like you wouldn't increase your mitochondrial capacity and then, if we're going to just simplify and say that mitochondrial capacity, is directly being measured by lactate threshold, you wouldn't do that unless you knew that, or unless it was clear that that would be like more energy efficient, right? So you wouldn't just spend more energy to increase your mitochondria for no reason, right? So if you're just exercising the same amount and then you want to see a 15% increase, but you continue exercising the same amount, then why would you continue to see that, right? Because then the body's just spending more energy doing that. So the idea would be that for each, whatever unit of mitochondrial increase, right, maybe you save, you go from that leads to make maybe a 10% energy savings per unit of work. I don't know, right? But something could be anything, right? But the point is to just try to illustrate the concept in a simple way. And so then if you're then spending more energy to produce more mitochondria, now at a certain point, you're not actually getting increased energy savings. You're just doing more energy expenditure to maintain those mitochondria. And that's why we get out of shape when we stop exercising, because it's like there's no energy efficiency there. So then that epigenetic engagement, is not going to happen anymore, because I think that's regulated right by the central governor. And essentially, that's what we're trying to, manipulate through training. Is we're trying to, create an environment artificially, but the central governor can't make a distinction between whether or not it's a recreational choice versus a survival need, and then it creates these benefits. And effectively, by increasing the scale of mitochondria, then if you're doing, again, 600 minutes of exercise a week, then you're going from a 4,000 calorie a day expenditure to a 3,000 calorie a day expenditure. And that's probably also why weight gain is so common in our modern food-rich environment, because most people, 90% of the population, it looks like, will just continue to gain weight very easily. Well, that's actually energy efficient, and the ability to consume a lot of energy and use relatively little is a preferred mechanism. So people who seem to be able to eat whatever they want, and obviously that's not true, absolutely, right? At a certain point, if you're eating a lot, you're going to gain weight. But people who seem to stay thin very easily, that's a minority of the population, because that's not a preferred trait. And those people I don't think are necessarily people who are going to be good athletes, because they're not naturally energy efficient. Naturally energy efficient people are more likely to be more athletic. And then obviously being more athletic is also a trait that should be naturally selected for, which also brings us back to a point I've talked about many times on the podcast, which is we should be able to be really good, most of us, but we just don't have the right approaches because of the social construction of how to train. That Vox Populi, Vox Dei becomes the truth, rather than using a rational, reasoned, and measured approach to determine if our training is effective. Right, and this is why the axiom of train, don't strain, is something that is totally underappreciated, and people prefer by far the no pain, no gain, because there's this sort of social jockeying that occurs, where if you can virtue signal that you can experience suffering and misery through training, that you are the superior, more deserving individual, and then I think we delude ourselves into thinking that's more likely to lead to positive effect. And there's mountains of ineffectual practice out there. And why does that happen then, right? Because if what I'm saying is true, why can't everybody think of it this way? Well, I think, first of all, a lot of people in sport are not always encouraged to really learn to think about things in a rational, reasoned, methodologically driven way. In other words, they're just not often intellectual. And that's not always true. But oftentimes within the culture of sports writ large, people are not always receptive to that. And there's exceptions. I'm generalizing. It's not traditionally a hyper intellectually curious problem-solving environment, and people like the idea of it's not that complicated, and keep it simple, stupid, those kinds of things. But one thing we could use here is one of my favorite pieces of economic thinking / game theory is Nash equilibrium, and I feel like that's something that you can use to really think about and explain a lot of behavior. And I think the reason why we see so much Vox Populi energy around stupid training ideas, I mean, let's just call a spade, right? Training that is very ineffective is stupid, right? It's a waste of your time, and doing things that are a waste of your time is stupid. So Nash equilibrium, tells us that Nash equilibrium occurs when neither side can do anything else to gain an additional competitive advantage. And, one way that people have conceptualized this functioning in terms of observed behavior is people basically emulating and trying to be as close to their competitors as possible. Sometimes literally, so gas stations and grocery stores and restaurants are all right next to their competition, right? And that's a Nash equilibrium. There's nothing they can do in that sense in terms of their location anyway to try to gain an advantage, because you're looking at the competitors, right? And what can I do relative to my competitors? But and you can measure, right, in a sense, you could calculate the Nash equilibrium, but Nash equilibrium is also behavioral, and that means it's a matter of perception and social construction. So, example, right, if they drink ketones, I drink ketones. It doesn't mean that ketones work, though. It just appears to people then that, well, they're doing that, I need to also pick that up, because what if it's giving them an advantage, right? So people, just because everybody is doing something and congregating around a strategy and implementing it in the same way, doesn't mean it's good. And the irony of this is then at the sort of like most important level of sport, which is like when we first get into it, whether that's as an adult or as a kid or as a young person or whatever, that's when we are most likely to be sort of vox populi into submission with these ideas that are just sort of rooted from this kind of Nash equilibrium, game theory phenomena of people trying to be as close to their competition as possible. And what that looks like is like people imitating their opponents, right? And for example, if you think your opponent is getting in better shape, then it makes sense for you to try to get in better shape. That's a good idea, okay? But if, your opponent dresses up in, I don't know, a Spider-Man costume and climbs across the roof every night at 3:00 in the morning, should you also be doing that to go from a 5-minute mile to a 4:40 mile? I mean, probably not, but like sometimes, and that's obvious, right? But some of these other things we can't tell because we don't have enough knowledge to recognize what is a like good, effective training practice and what is the equivalent of dressing up in a Spider-Man costume and running around on your roof in the middle of the night. So like when we think about Nash equilibrium, here at Black Cats Run, we're thinking that, the Nash equilibrium effect is, okay, how can I have my lactate threshold? Like, what is the point at which I can't gain any further advantage? Well, when my lactate threshold is as high as it can possibly be, right? Especially if it can be as high as possible relative to my competition, now I am at a point of advantage. But because people don't think about and measure strategy in the right way, people are arriving at the wrong Nash equilibriums. So this is like people telling me, 30 miles a week, that's 10K training. Okay, well, that's dumb. That doesn't make any sense. But that's in their mind. That is true, right? So then they're like, okay, well, we can't do that because, I need to be as close to 5K training as possible because I'm trying to run a 5K or I'm trying to coach people to run 5K. So doing 10K training, that's going further away from what is the best strategy, right? And so there's not all sort of Nash equilibriums of behavior are actually the most valid or correct Nash equilibrium. But that's what we essentially, I would say, see happening a lot, unfortunately. And ultimately what we're trying to then do instead is think about things like, okay, how can we keep training aerobic? How can we regulate fatigue? How can we think about strategy as like an aggregate approach? And when we regulate fatigue, for example, right? So when we ask the question like, well, how should I train? How hard should I train? That's not the right question then, right? The real question is like, how can I manage fatigue? Okay, because fatigue is, oppositional to performance. It's oppositional to training. Fatigue is oppositional to improvement. Fatigue is the cause of injury. It's the cause of burnout. It's the cause of inconsistency. If you do a simple approach, if you think about fatigue on a 1, 2, 3 scale, 1, 0 fatigue in the muscles. I'm not talking about you wake up in the morning and you're sad because you wish it was the weekend and you could sleep for another hour. That's not the kind of fatigue I'm talking about. Okay. 2 would be I have some slight muscular fatigue. And then 3 is I have noticeable muscular fatigue and I am working against it. During training, we always want to be at a 1. Okay. And because muscular fatigue is really only being incurred when we fail to train aerobically, right? And so again, this comes back to train, don't strain. The don't strain sort of like is imperative in there because if we're straining, we're inducing the fatigue. And then when we induce the fatigue, now we cannot engage the epigenetic response because as we accumulate fatigue, okay, that's the central governor. Like feelings of pain like that pain that we feel from fatigue is how we know we're fatigued, right? In a sense. And like, where does that pain come from? Well, that comes from the brain. Well, we're not consciously being like, I'm going to be in pain now. So that means it's the central governor, right? So if we're doing that, then we're not engaging the right level of response there. And then, like that relationship between it's oppositional to performance training and improvement is because it causes injury, burnout, and inconsistency. And injury, burnout, and inconsistency are oppositional to performance training and improvement. And we need to understand that fatigue is the interlocutor, or is the key measure here. And the irony is that when people most need to control their training and do it well, they're most likely to ignore fatigue. And the reason why most people will not go from a 5-minute mile to a 4:40 mile, or a 6-minute mile to a 5:40 mile, is due to the fact that they don't manage their fatigue properly. Because if your fatigue is a 1 every day, then two things are true. Your training is balanced, okay? And you're not digging yourself a hole out of which you're then going to crash and, struggle to recuperate from. And then the other thing that's also true is you're going to be able to do whatever it is you need to do the next day. And so knowing and having a really clear sense of where that lactate threshold is and using that to regulate training intensity, right? You're really doing is you're regulating fatigue, okay? And when we approach it in this way, we're going to see better results, because then that's possible to make that scale of improvement. And that's the name of the game here, is to find our way towards strategies that are going to be most effective at leading us to make aggregated improvements over time. Because if you play these things out over time and you're working towards a long-term view, then you're going to continue to see progression. And then whether it's going from a 6-minute mile to a 5:40 mile, or if it's making a jump from a 5-minute mile to a 4:40 mile, it no longer matters if you're jumping into a level of performance that seems rarefied. What matters is, are you using a training strategy where the training strategy shows that that's going to be effective? And that's what I find to be probably one of the most exciting things about individual endurance sports, like running in particular, right? Kind of my original area where I really got into this stuff, but any of them really, but especially in running, because you can measure things in these ways. That it's harder to do sometimes in stuff like cycling. But what I find most exciting is this possibility that like you can find a competitive advantage. And when you recognize that the norm of what is and isn't possible is just a fallacy of the landscape of, Vox Populi, Vox Dei think, you realize that like you have this incredible opportunity to outcompete and outperform your peers and your competitors because you're using your brain more effectively. And that's the whole fun of it, is to try out what you can come up with and then come out of the wilderness of that training and preparation and show what you've created. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've enjoyed this or any of our other episodes, please feel free to, love to have a chance to engage with more people out there who are interested in this stuff. So refer this to other people. If you want to reach out to us and talk to us directly, you can send us a message on our Instagram page at Black Cats Run. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Bailey.